I am really excited. I wanted to kick off the day with someone I've been a fan of for a long time. Somebody you'll see on Late Night with Bill Maher, somebody you'll see often on news shows. You'll see him all over the country talking about conservatism, talking about the future of the Republican Party, and talking about a lot of things that I've been very interested in for a long time, and I was so honored when he agreed to come out. His name's Reihan Salam. He's the executive editor of the National Review and a National Review Policy Fellow. He's a contributing editor of National Affairs, a board member of the New America Foundation, and an advisor to the Energy Innovation Reform Project, and he's just a brilliant guy. I picked him up to bring him here this morning, and right from the beginning, it was interesting. So I'm so excited that he came. Please welcome Reihan Salam. Thanks very much. All right. One of the things that Reihan did, he wrote a book several years ago called, it was in partnership with Ross Douthat. Ross Douthat, a writer at the New York Times. There it is. John has it back there. John, you made it. It's called The Grand New Party, How Conservatives Can Win the Working Class and Save the American Dream. That was published right after 2008, was it?
It was in 2008, yes.
You guys have written a kind of update, an essay in the New York Times called Trumpism.
A Cure for Trumpism.
I should have wrote that down. So, and I loved it. It was fantastic. So we're going to talk about that. But let's start, first of all, Monday. Monday night, we have the Super Bowl. Actually, now this is like the playoffs of this incredible election. An amazing encounter between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. What are you going to be watching for? What are you going to be interested in as that show comes on?
Two of the most unpopular people in America.
Yeah.
Squaring off to determine who is slightly more hateable. So basically, the big challenge is that Hillary Clinton has been to this rodeo before. She has debated before. She's been on a national stage for a very, very long time. Keep in mind, going way, way back, Bill and Hillary Clinton were partners going back to the 1970s in Arkansas. Small state, but a state that had pretty brass knuckles, tough politics. And also the Clintons, they really kind of came of age in Arkansas at a time when the Reagan Revolution was underway. And so they were trying to kind of figure out this very different political landscape. And now, she's gone through so many different iterations politically that, she just has a lot of experience with this. Okay. Not sure what to do about that. Hello?
Yeah, here.
Hi there. And Donald Trump has not been involved in political life for so long. So the big bar for him to clear is, does he seem plausible? Does he seem ready to address questions of substance? Is he kind of there to play? Earlier on, throughout the primaries, he faced off against multiple challengers. And when there was a prospect of him facing only, let's say, 2 other challengers, the debate didn't actually happen. So that's very interesting to see. What's it going to be like when there are only 2 candidates up there? And basically, he's going to be held to account a lot more than had been the case when he had multiple candidates on stage. But my sense is that if he seems plausible, if he seems disciplined, if he's able to answer these substantive questions reasonably well, that will help him much, much more than it will help Hillary Clinton. So that's the opportunity for him.
Yeah, we were talking last night at an event, and by the way, let me just break. I really need to thank Ryan Klumpner and Public Dynamics and the Lincoln Club for sponsoring that this morning. Thank you so much, you guys, for making this possible. We have so many sponsors, and San Diego State University, too. I'm going to be talking about them all day. This has really been a wonderful partnership put together with them. There are nearly a dozen student reporters covering today's session, and Dr. Bailing Shaw is the director of the School of Journalism. Her support and the rest of the staff has been just amazing. So thank you so much. Bailing, are you here? Oh, hey, so much. Been wonderful partners. Sorry, some of the formal things I'm supposed to do, I get a little nervous about. So Let me ask you, let's go back to the debate. So I was asked about this last night at an event too, and what I tried to argue was it seemed like Hillary Clinton couldn't just, fact check or catch Donald Trump in a hiccup or a lie. She would actually have to create a sense of being almost contemptuous of him. There would have to be so much of a superiority difference that for her to come out of it as a winner. What would she have to do to demonstrate sort of superiority out of that debate?
I guess I look at it a little bit differently. My basic, larger view is that Hillary Clinton is underperforming with the Obama coalition. If you look at voters under the age of 35, she is just not doing nearly as well as Barack Obama did in 2008 and 2012. If you look at African American voters, they just appear to be less engaged. There was an expectation going to this election that Hispanic, Latino voters would be incredibly enthusiastic and fired up, if only to oppose Donald Trump. And that does not, in fact, appear to be the case, or rather, it doesn't appear to be the case evenly. This is a big country. The Hispanic population is very diverse. But in a state like Florida, for example, it depends on which survey you're looking at, but it looks like Hillary Clinton is doing worse relative to her Republican rival than Barack Obama did relative to Mitt Romney. So fundamentally, a lot of what we're hearing in the press, for example, about the birther controversy. As a lot of you guys know, for many years, Donald Trump spoke about Barack Obama's birth, questioning whether or not he was in fact born in Hawaii, something that caused a lot of controversy and a lot of anger among supporters of the president in particular. Now, it's very interesting to see. So over the last couple of weeks, a few things have happened. When I look at the mainstream press, I see a lot of talk about things like the birther controversy, other outrageous things Donald Trump has said. But then the thing is that the mainstream press isn't the only way people get news, right? Another thing Donald Trump did is he went on Dr. Oz. Now, I imagine a lot of you guys have heard about Dr. Oz. And if you're looking at Donald Trump, what is his big strategic challenge? The strategic challenge is that Mitt Romney received the support of about 92% of Republican voters. Right now, Donald Trump is getting a pretty high share, about 88%, 88, 89% of Republican voters, depending on the survey. He would need to do at least as well as Mitt Romney, if not a bit better. If you're looking at the states that are the big challenge for him going forward in this election, if he were to win Pennsylvania, he's won the whole thing. Right now, the states that are on the bubble are states like Nevada, Colorado, and what have you. But if he wins Pennsylvania, that's a huge deal. So one way to think about this is that everything he does has to be oriented towards married white women in Pennsylvania. In fact, if he said from now on, every wonderful thing I'm going to do, particularly for married white women in Pennsylvania, would actually be a very smart thing for him to do strategically. And what he did in the last couple of weeks is he offered a plan for low-income working mothers to receive benefits for 6 weeks. That's something that no other Republican has done before. That's a pretty big thing. Now, you don't hear about that, generally speaking, on NBC News, or the New York Times might talk about it in passing, but not really nearly as much about some of the outrageous things he says. When he went on the Dr. Oz show, which, again, you guys, if you know Dr. Oz, that's not a news show. But when he went on the Dr. Oz show, he said, you know what, I actually believe that we should have Medicaid for poor people. We should expand Medicaid. Now, if you've been paying attention to the last several years of politics, you will see a lot of people saying that Republicans oppose Medicaid expansions. They oppose giving people access to Medicaid, maybe because they're racist or something like that, et cetera. So this is actually a very, very big thing that you simply don't hear in some corners. Now, I'm not saying that ergo Donald Trump is great. Your mileage may vary as to whether those things are good or not. But what I'm saying is that you could say there's over news and under news. There's over news that happens through official news channels, and that comes through journalists who think of themselves in a certain way. They tend to be college educated. They tend to be socially liberal. They tend not to think particularly well of Donald Trump. So, if Donald Trump is for Medicaid expansion and he's for a program for low-income working mothers, they don't hear that, or they don't care. They think that's all a lie, or kind of whatever else. What they really care about are these things about the birther controversy, inflammatory remarks about immigrants. And again, I'm not saying they're wrong to care about those things. So in caring about those things, Hillary Clinton wants the focus to be there because that could gin up enthusiasm with that Obama coalition that is not enthusiastic about her right now. So, I mean, this is just one big picture thing to keep in mind. And in the debate, if you believe that the strategy is Hillary Clinton should be contemptuous toward Donald Trump, that totally makes sense if you buy a particular model of the election in which what really matters is just firing up people that Barack Obama fired up and that and Bernie Sanders fired up in many cases, but that Hillary Clinton has failed to excite.
One of the things that when I try to talk about this is, when you ask Bernie Sanders, or when you look at Bernie Sanders, or when you look at Donald Trump, it's very easy to see who they blame for the problem, right? Bernie Sanders had his villains, and Donald Trump has his outsiders, immigrants, all kinds of negative actors, evildoers, whatever. When you think about that with Hillary Clinton, though, it's very difficult to actually identify who she blames for problems. She'll talk about people like deplorables. She'll talk about people, but that's people she finds almost annoying or different, or they're somebody we shouldn't listen to, which I agree with. But my point is that those two offered a sort of worldview, a way of, they educated people. They helped them as they were talking, whether it was wrong or racist or problematic, they offered people a worldview. This is the Donald Trump worldview, this is the Bernie Sanders worldview. And Hillary Clinton, I'm not sure has done that. She's made it clear that she has a lot of priorities, and if she were to identify villains, it would almost be the climate change and actual forces and problems, stuff like that. Is that a fair take, do you think?
I believe that she has identified many villains over the course of her career, and again, we might disagree about how appropriate some of these villains are, but one way to look at this, and this is not the most charitable interpretation, but I'll just throw it out there. For Hillary Clinton, she has had many different ideological perspectives over the course of her career. And, you don't have to blame someone for that. Because, look, she's been in politics for decades at this point. She became politically engaged in the late 1960s as a young woman. And the country has changed a lot over that time. So she's had many, many different perspectives. But one thing that I believe she has come to believe, and this is not uncommon for a politician who's been battle-tested, battle-scarred, who's been around for a long period of time, is that she believes that her heart is in the right place. She is, a good person who means well. And so the people who have been out to destroy her, in her mind, over the years, those people are the bad guys. Now, the thing is, if you go way back to 1995, 1996, this was a very different time. It's even hard for me to imagine that was 20 years ago. But because a lot of us were politically aware back then. But back then, Bill Clinton spoke he had pretty tough language about illegal immigration that Hillary Clinton agreed with. It was amazing. At the Democratic National Convention in 2016, there was a young lady, Astrid Silva, who talked about when her family came into the United States when she was very young, when she was 4 years old. That was and her family came in 1994. Now, it happens that when her parents entered the country illegally, Bill Clinton was president. So it's kind of interesting. That's not something she talked about much during the speech. And of course, Bill Clinton, during that period in 1995, he said, we're going to do something. We're going to strengthen the border. We're going to bring an end to this because this is disorder. This is bad. Okay. But that contradiction was never really addressed. And also back then, Hillary Clinton supported her husband in backing pretty tough punitive criminal justice policies. Now we look 20 years later, the picture is very different. Hillary Clinton talks about immigration. She talks about criminal justice very differently than she did 20 years ago, but also even than in 2008. In 2008, one of the big dividing lines between Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton was a very seemingly minor issue. Eliot Spitzer, the Democratic governor of New York at the time, came out in favor of giving driver's licenses to unauthorized immigrants. Barack Obama was for that. Hillary Clinton said, we want to offer legalization and what have you, but we should not be giving people's driver's licenses at this point. And the Democratic primary electorate was pretty different then. That was because back then there were more white working class voters among Democratic primary voters. So again, now her position is totally different. But I kind of suspect that from her perspective, it might be this view that, hey, I've always been on the side of good. And sometimes I've had to compromise, or sometimes I've had to take a stance that's not exactly mine, but my heart is in the right place, and how dare anyone not believe that? How dare anyone not believe that my heart is always in the right place? When Black Lives Matter protesters, Black Lives Matter's protesters came to her, her reaction to them was, you guys, I'm on your side. How can you possibly doubt that? So I think that's a challenge when you've been in politics for a really long time and you really believe that you're a good person. And partly you believe, gosh, these people against me, they're trying to destroy me, they're deplorable, and what have you. It's the mentality that you fall into. So I think that's a big challenge for her, because there are some people who are saying, whether they're people who are to her left, they're saying, actually, no. I don't necessarily trust you, having seen your record over a longer period of time. And there are people to her right who are thinking, oh, wait a second, so which version of you am I disagreeing with, number one? And number two, which version of you am I wrong to disagree with? So I think that, and again, I'm not saying that she's a terrible person or anything like that, but that is the challenge of being someone who's been in the public eye, who's taken positions for a really, really long time.
Let me ask you, so in The Cure for Trumpism, you write about how the Republican Party actually depends on working class voters, and you mentioned this earlier about what he could do in Pennsylvania. And you write this, if Trump's working class supporters were voting as much for the man as for his message, they were also clearly voting against a party leadership that pays them lip service while ignoring their real concerns. And then you list 4 or 5 concerns: stagnant wages, family breakdown, military quagmires, opioid abuse and suicide. And basically, right, if they keep stringing these voters along with symbolism, they will eventually seek another Trump. What do you mean by symbolism?
Well, one way to think about it is that politicians use crafted language. So basically, when you have public opinion that's in this one place, what you try to do is you try to figure out, well, what are the things that I already care about and already want to do? And then I use a certain kind of language so that they line up together. So for example, just as an example, let's say people like the idea of middle-class tax cuts, but they don't care about tax cuts for wealthy people. They might even oppose tax cuts for wealthy people. So then, what you would do is you would use crafted language that emphasizes that you're delivering tax relief, even if a lot of that tax relief you're delivering is actually the kind of tax relief that ordinary voters don't care about that much. It's about what you emphasize in your message, because the truth is that the kind of people who run for office are systematically very different from ordinary rank-and-file voters. And basically, you have people who are ideological, whether they're ideological on the right or the left, and then they're trying to connect with voters who tend not to be very engaged with political issues. So you kind of try to find a few areas where, hey, that sounds familiar, or that sounds plausible, that sounds attractive. And over time, you sometimes get a bigger and bigger disconnect between the kind of things that the people who are voting for you care about and the kind of things that the people in charge actually care about and advance. Because my belief is that most people are not really that ideological as such. They vote more on the basis of group identity and group interest. What kind of person am I? And does this candidate represent the kind of people like me? So in 2008, it's a great example of this. If you look at someone like Sarah Palin, there are a lot of people who are like, Sarah Palin's an idiot, da-da-da. But the thing is that for a lot of people, wait a second, she's a working mother with a big family. She's someone who speaks in a kind of, plain, straight-ahead kind of way. And, maybe, I identify with her. So when people are insulting her and saying that her manner of communicating and what have you is stupid or terrible, well, I feel like you're insulting me. It was very personal. And similarly, Barack Obama, for people who felt like, good God, George W. Bush is an embarrassment. He's so silly, he's so dumb, he's embarrassing the country. Hey, Barack Obama is someone who is so dazzlingly articulate and impressive. And if you're someone who is a bit younger, you think, hey, he looks like my version of America. If you're someone who grew up in San Diego, let's say, and let's say you're Filipino, but your husband is black, and you look at Barack Obama, hey, that's someone who's like me. That person, leaving policies aside, you feel like he speaks to you, he connects with you in a very visceral kind of way, right? So again, there are people who are very sophisticated and think about policy issues and what have you, but there are other people who are like, they might be sophisticated too, but it's not their job to think about politics all day, so it's kind of visceral. And that's why when you look at a lot of politics, it's kind of like, okay, how do I connect on that visceral gut level? I'm like you, kind of I'm a patriot, or kind of I'm this or that, or like, I'm not a racist, something like that. I kind of like share your cultural messages. And then when it comes to nitty-gritty policy questions, I often find that the differences between the two parties for the last 20 years, they seem a lot bigger when you listen to the rhetoric than they really are. You have a lot of Republicans say, I'm anti-government, but of course, I'm totally fine with Medicare and Social Security and kind of what have you. You know what I mean? It's one of these things where group identity matters, and that is part of what makes our political dynamic so poisonous, because you're not really offering contrasting agendas.
Yeah, a lot of what you write, though, are actually policy prescriptions. And you make that case that they need to do those kinds of policy prescriptions in order to attract that working class again. Isn't there a contradiction between that and this identity politics you've just described?
There's definitely a tension. So, and I'll tell you guys, I've been working in politics in one form or another for a pretty long time. And I will say when I started out, the thing that really got me excited was, it was this idea that the free enterprise economy, which I believe is a good and valuable thing, needs people to believe in it and to have faith in it, okay? So if you believe that the system is rigged, on left or right, if you're someone who grows up in a kind of, working class or poor family, and you just believe there's no point in my working hard, because actually it would take a miracle for me to jump through all these different hoops for that hard work to translate into some kind of stability and success. So that's what really motivated me at first, that's why I was interested in policy issues. The challenge is, the more I've learned about politics, practical politics, what I've come to realize is that, most people, they don't really think about how is this policy going to lead to this outcome? Because the truth is that we don't actually always know. There's so many things at work. Like, you could have the most wonderful, amazing idea, and then the global economy crashes and you've got a recession, and then you look like a terrible president, right? You don't have any control over it. Or you could be terrible, and then the global economy is great, and then you're like, oh, well, I actually have been a genius all along. It's just kind of the nature of these things, right? So what I think really does matter in politics is, do you convey to people, because of this identity thing I was telling you before, do you convey to people that you are fighting for them, that you believe in them, that you're going to hold faith with them? And if you do that, people will go along and they'll be more inclined to trust you. So I talked before about how Hillary Clinton has, for very good reasons, and also for less good reasons, has had many different political identities over the past 20, 30 years, okay? But the thing is that there are certain kinds of people. Let's say you're like Hillary Clinton. You're someone who, you're a baby boomer. You went to a good college. Maybe you went to a good law school. You're kind of a smart person. You're upwardly mobile. You think of yourself as a liberal, but also, hey, you don't want super high taxes. You don't necessarily agree with everything Bernie Sanders has to say. So for you, Hillary Clinton, you trust her because she's like you. And you trust that, sometimes you might disagree with her, but you trust that she's eventually taking you to the right place. There's that gut level connection. But if you're a working class Latino kid from the South Bronx, maybe you're like, I don't have that trust. Who's this? What is her connection to me? What is her connection to my life? Whereas Bernie Sanders was talking about things that feel very viscerally connected. So for me, when I look at the Republican candidates who ran in 2016, I look at someone like Jeb Bush, who really just kind of expected to win the nomination. And someone like Jeb Bush, the problem is that on a certain basic level, if you're a middle class or working class, white American voter, okay? On a certain level, you feel like, does Jeb Bush even like people like me? Like, does he kind of like, does he, because he talks about immigrants, people like my parents, and how great and amazing and hardworking they are, and they're the best of America. Okay, well, what about me? My family's been here for a long time, and, maybe I have a decent middle class life, but I see my kids struggling. Does this guy even like people like us? So before you even get to the point of which policy prescription is better or worse, there's that question of, does this person understand the life of people like me? You look at 2008 and 2012. The big problem for John McCain and Mitt Romney was this one polling question. Does this person understand the lives of people like me? And then in both cases, John McCain and Mitt Romney, both of whom, by the way, are millionaires, they both did pretty badly on that question. And also, most people who felt like he didn't understand the lives of people like them, whether it's McCain or Romney, didn't vote for him, right? Whereas Barack Obama, both times, even though he himself is a very successful guy, highly educated, but people felt like he understands the lives of people like me. He conveyed that successfully. So that dynamic matters within primaries as well. And if you can't establish that, You can have all of the brilliant plans cooked up in all of the kind of terrific think tanks or universities or whatever, and it does not matter at all.
Well, I think I would suggest an alternative title to your essay, The Cure for Trumpism. And I would say the case for why the Republican Party should embrace the welfare state and entitlements. Would that be fair? It seems like, and progressive taxation, because it seems like you make the case that they focus too much on taxes cuts for the rich. They shouldn't try to obsess over entitlement reform that actually means a threat, something threatening. They give lip service to protecting it. But and then you make the case that Donald Trump embraced entitlements, even embraced socialized medicine, and depending on what day you talk to him, but even embraced things like that and wasn't punished for it. Would that be fair to say that it was a case for why the Republican Party should maybe drop some of those fights?
Well, so the thing to understand is that the Republican Party has embraced the welfare state. That's just the reality on the ground. And so the question is more actually, what does that mean? What do you believe it ought to look like? And what have you? And this is a kind of, much longer discussion. But just briefly, my view is that if you look at the Obamacare fight, there's a lot of wishful thinking in politics, and it's not just on the part of ordinary voters, it's on the part of the people who are actually making decisions as well. So when you look at the fight over Obamacare, what you'll find is that the reason a lot of rank-and-file voters were resistant to Obamacare is because they thought, well, wait a second, you're creating a new social program, and to finance this new social program, you're going to take money out of an existing social program. So the idea was you're going to reduce the growth rate in Medicare spending over time, and then we're going to use that to finance this new program. Now, the thing is, if you look at the people who are going to be the main beneficiaries of Obamacare, this was a different group of people than the people who are benefiting from the Medicare program. So by definition, the Medicare program benefits people who are over the age of 65, number one. But also, if you look at the people who are uninsured in the United States before Obamacare, 27% of them are foreign-born, are immigrants. And in the country, about 13% of people are foreign-born. So it's about 2x that, okay? And that's something that wasn't talked about directly, but here's the thing. A lot of Republicans, elite Republicans, they're like, oh, people oppose Obamacare because they want small government and because they hate the idea of new entitlements. But actually, no, that wasn't really it. It was more, hey, they want to protect an existing entitlement to prevent the creation of a new entitlement because they were concerned that this new entitlement might endanger the old entitlement, okay? Now, we can debate kind of what the settlement should have been or what have you, but I kind of think that the thing is that a lot of it's wishful thinking. And some people, the people who understood that were people who had to run campaigns because they actually understood which messages are actually resonating. But the thing is that if I'm a politician, you might think, oh, well, I'm running for Congress. I've got to think about what people, in my congressional district care about. Well, not really. If you're in a district that's overwhelmingly Democratic, then you care about, well, am I going to have a Democratic primary challenger? It's the same thing on the Republican side. And then how many people show up for a primary? The mayor of New York City, Bill de Blasio, won, and there were kind of a couple 100,000 people in a city of 8.3 million who showed up for the Democratic primary. It's really extraordinary. So the thing is that you've got to know who are the people who turn out, and also, if you're a politician, who are the people I see and talk to? If you're Governor Scott Walker of Wisconsin, the people that you see and talk to, the voters you see and talk to, are small business owners. They're the kind of people who show up at the Kiwanis Club and show up at the Rotary Club, okay? Those are the people you talk to, and they're the ones whose problems you kind of understand. So that is the big, big, big disconnect. Because you have politicians who travel like any of us. How many of you guys know people whose lives are radically different from your own? Your closest friends are people who are pretty similar to you, right? That's the case for politicians too, but the problem is in politics that winds up getting you to this very poisonous place. So what you have are people who say that they're anti-government, but say, oh, I'm anti-government except with regard to these huge social programs that are actually the biggest parts of government and government's growth over time. So what I and my friends and sort of people like me have been arguing is that if you really care about things like the size of government, how government works and what have you, you have to be willing to kind of get under the hood and kind of figure out how those things work rather than just kind of assert that you're against X, Y, or Z. But again, that doesn't really matter until you convey to people that you're fighting for them.
If the Republican Party embraced that point of view, it feels like a major realignment in politics would be in store, right? Like that if you could support those entitlements and yet not have to align yourself with some of the coalitions that the Democrats have put together, that seems like a pretty powerful new party.
So you guys have done me the great honor of showing up to this event really early, and I'm afraid of putting you to sleep. But the one thing I will tell you about entitlements is that there are some subtleties here about what it means to, because the thing is that entitlements can be structured in lots of different ways, right? So the one thing I would argue is that people in my camp, what we're saying is that actually Social Security needs to work in a different way. But the problem is when Republicans say, well, the problem with Social Security is that it's so expensive, that's a terrible message. A much better message is that we believe in what Social Security does. It protects older people from poverty. That is important. That's a baseline mission. We care about that. And we believe that we have a better way to make that work and a better way that's going to make it more sustainable over time. If we're on the road we're on right now, it's not going to work. And also, to prove that to you, there are a lot of people in this country who actually are not even eligible for Social Security benefits. To say that we're going to have a minimum benefit that's going to protect everybody. And then beyond that, for people who are much wealthier, then we're going to think about this for people who are, let's say, 55 and younger. But you talk about it in a way that's saying, we believe in what this program is protecting, and it's about more than spending money. And if we have to spend more money to make it work, we'll do that. But what we care about is what it's supposed to do. And that's the same thing with Medicare and what have you. Just number one, establish that you understand the value of this program rather than just dollars and cents, because it's really a moral issue, okay? And then when we're talking about the welfare state more broadly, what I would say is that for a lot of Americans, and some of you guys might disagree with me on this, but for a lot of Americans, there's a belief, and you saw this with welfare reform. I'm okay with spending the same amount of money. I might even be okay with spending more money if I believe that these programs are encouraging people to work, if they're actually inculcating certain kinds of values, if they're actually seeing to it that communities are not isolated in poverty. We want to be sure that everyone, to the extent they can, is doing their best to make a contribution. And if you're doing that, we will stand with you and we will help you. That is a very different attitude from other people who believe that that's the wrong way to think about it. Other people believe everyone is entitled by virtue of being a human being, and if you can't work or you choose not to work, that's okay. There are many smart people who believe that, but that's a very different perspective. So in a way, it's not about am I for entitlements or against entitlements. It's more, do I believe that the safety net should have some kind of moral foundation, the idea that we're all in this together. Okay? And when I believe in what I believe the Republican Party, what the right I would want it to be about, is the idea that, look, we have lots of differences, we're different people, but in some ways we've got to come together. And someone's got to be in charge of keeping the wheels from flying off the car. And when that means, when we're talking about the safety net, we're not going to get rid of this tomorrow. Nor should we get rid of it tomorrow. But we should put it on a sound basis that's in tune with people's moral gut instincts and see to it that actually, poor people believe that the system isn't rigged against them, but also rich people know, hey, by the way, if you're, kind of cheating the tax system, or if you're actually kind of taking advantage of everything this country has to give to you, but then you're actually taking advantage of those things, then kind of running off and sending your money to some offshore tax haven, that's a problem. So the idea is that it's a kind of unifying message. Nationalism, that term has been thrown around a lot this election. And nationalism, a lot of people see it as purely divisive. But I believe that nationalism, there's another version of nationalism that's actually unifying and saying that I might be an Asian American who is a middle-class professional living in New York City, but if there's a second-generation Mexican-American kid living in East LA, if that person feels like the system is rigged against him, that matters for me. That person's not my child, that person's not my cousin, but it matters for me because we're all in this together. And I believe that that is a message that, in my view, is a natural message for the political right, and I believe that they haven't done a good job of really advancing it.
One of the other points you make, I think, succinctly is Well, I'll just read it. It's the consensus critique of President Obama from not Trump Republicans often seemed to be that he should have kept more troops in Iraq and kept more troops in Afghanistan and sent more troops to Libya and intervened in Syria and sent more arms to Ukraine and expanded NATO's presence in the Baltics and been willing to bomb Iran. And that so few of them were willing to say the 5 words, invading Iraq was a mistake. Why is that such an important point in your point of view?
So the one tricky thing about co-authoring an article is that my co-author Ross Douthat is one of my best friends, and there are areas where we are 100% on the same page, and there are other areas where we're less so. And I will say that between the two of us, I am probably a little bit more hawkish. I'm a bit more in favor of a big military and all the rest. But the point we were trying to convey there is you have to tell people a story that hangs together. And one of the great tragedies for me of the last several years in politics is that Mitt Romney, at the second debate in 2012, there was a town hall, and there's a woman from Long Island who said, I'm an undecided voter. I voted for Barack Obama in 2008, but I'm open-minded, kind of not that happy with how things have gone. But the one thing is, I really believe that the Bush presidency was a disaster. So I want you to tell me, how will you do things differently than George W. Bush? And Mitt Romney didn't answer the question. First he said, well, let me go back to a previous question. Then he said, well, here's my 5-point plan. But he didn't actually answer what is a pretty obvious, straightforward question. When Jeb Bush, this time around in 2016, was asked, well, tell me about the Iraq War. Holy cow, Jeb Bush, your brother was the president who invaded Iraq. If you're not prepared for this question, that's a big question mark about how ready you are to do any goddamn thing, right? And he struggled with that question, and then he said, yes, I'd support it, and then later said no, and then eventually came around to, I think it was a mistake. So what I believe is that I don't really care where you come down on that issue. Well, obviously I have my own view on it, but you've got to have a coherent story you're telling about how you fit things together. Now, what I believe is a coherent story, there's a guy named Brent Scowcroft who was an advisor to President George H.W. Bush, and he's a guy who said invading Iraq is a really bad idea. We shouldn't do it right now. Saddam Hussein is a terrible guy, and no one in the second Bush administration listened to him. Now, Brent Scowcroft said we should not invade, but then later he said, well, we should stay. We need to keep some kind of residual force. That's basically like the least popular position you could possibly take. It happens to be my position. I think that position was sound. But the thing is that if you're not able to convey, if you're not able to connect with people who believe that, and actually, by the way, it's one thing I want to convey to you is that it's not so easy to say that it was a mistake when you're talking about people who had relatives who died in that war. People, or you yourself fought in that war. So for people to simply say it was a mistake and we should never have done it, that's actually pretty tough. You're trying to speak to many different constituencies. Ronald Reagan said that the Vietnam War was an honorable cause. Now, of course, there are a lot of people, I'm sure, in this room and around the country who would disagree with that, but it was actually a very particular way of trying to square a certain circle, of saying that, kind of even if you believe there are going to be people on one side of that debate or another, but you've got to have some way to talk to people that registers that you realize what had gone wrong, but that going forward, you are a person who's able to take that in and take in some of the lessons of that experience.
Okay, so Rai Ravard is out here with a microphone. If you have a question, raise your hand. I'm going to ask another couple of questions here. One of the things that's not in your piece that is kind of a big deal around here these days, we have a Republican mayor named Kevin Faulconer. He embraced what's called the Climate Action Plan, and it's unique around the country because it's enforceable. It's a set of goals for 100% renewable energy in the city, or electricity, as we clarified, and then also a 50% reduction in greenhouse gases over the next 20 years. It's a significant goal. At the heart of it, of course, is the assumption that man and human industry is accelerating climate change, and we need to address it. One of the things that's not in your piece is climate change, is the discussion about climate change. And one of the things I've wondered for a while is if a conservative thinker like you or a right-of-center thinker were to approach climate change and say, okay, we accept that human activity, human industry is contributing to this acceleration and this problem, as the mayor here did, what would that look like? how would that feel? What kind of discussions about solutions would we have?
Well, you guys might know that there is a nuclear power plant called Diablo Canyon here in California. And you see there are people hissing, so there are people who are not big fans of it. So you're going to hiss even more now. But I believe that Diablo Canyon is a really interesting example of a much bigger phenomenon. So the one thing you can say about nuclear power is that it's a zero carbon energy source. And so the thing is that when you shut down Diablo Canyon, you guys, in case you haven't noticed, people want to live in California. And the thing is that actually, if anything, more people are going to want to live here. The other interesting thing about California is that California is in a part of the country, particularly coastal California, where you have a relatively mild climate. If you're looking at a place like the Bay Area, for example, and down here in San Diego, particularly in the coastal parts, you don't need as much energy for heating as you do in other parts of the country, like the northeastern United States, okay? So the California Legislative Analyst's Office put out a very, very big report talking about housing and the housing crunch in California. And if you really thought about climate change, well, one big thing that you'd want to do is move people away from areas that are where you need a more energy-intensive lifestyle to places where you don't need as much heating and cooling, because that's a huge part of energy consumption. So that means that in a way, you'd want a lot more people living in coastal California. But guess what? As I'm sure a lot of you guys who live in beautiful coastal neighborhoods know, you don't want a million new neighbors. You don't want high rises. So that's actually a big challenge and a big tension. Throughout, and we don't have to get into that right now, but I think that's a part of the picture. The bigger part of the picture, the bigger part of the picture is that when you shut down Diablo Canyon, and this is, by the way, not just a California thing. In Germany and Japan, there have been a lot of places that have relied pretty heavily on nuclear power that are saying we're going to now shut down these nuclear plants. Now, what happens in every single place you shut down a nuclear plant? You start burning more natural gas. And sometimes you start burning more coal. Now, you guys are smart people, you read the news, et cetera, so you know that coal is a pretty carbon-intensive energy source, whereas nuclear is zero. And so one thing is that, one thing I'd start by saying is, do no harm. And I personally believe that shutting down Diablo Canyon is, in my opinion, a big mistake for that reason if you care about the bigger climate change picture. Now, we can talk all day long about other things you might do, and I certainly have done some work on this and have thought about this and happy to talk about it more. But I believe that ultimately, energy-intensive lifestyles, they're unavoidable. That's the way of the future. Between now and 2060, on a global basis, 2.5 billion people are going to move to cities around the world. And I say a city, and you have an idea in your head, and that's where people are jumbled together and live together. But actually, the real thing, the gut level thing about what a city is, the base level thing about what a city is a city is a place where people use a lot of energy. And sometimes it's going to be less carbon intensive, you have more density, sometimes not, but fundamentally you're using a lot more energy than if you were engaging in subsistence agriculture. 2.5 billion people living in cities, that's a lot of energy. And if you don't have zero carbon energy sources like nuclear that are part of that picture, it's going to be very tough to reconcile that movement to cities with avoiding drastic increases in carbon emissions. So that's the level at which you've got to think about this stuff.
Rai, did you find somebody? Oh, any questions? Okay, so one of the things that, okay, we've got a few up here, Dan and then Jeremy. Well, let me ask you this. So the National Review got a lot of attention when it did its whole Never Trump issues. Feels like you're doing a lot of rationalization of perhaps supporting Trump. Where did you end up?
So one thing is that the issue that we put out was an issue before the Iowa caucus, and it was against Trump. But basically, we're a big tent. We have a lot of people with different views. And personally, I believe that Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton would be bad presidents, and I don't intend to vote for either of them. But that's my personal opinion. The opinion of National Review as an institution is something that is settled on by many people together. And I will say that a majority of people who took part in the Republican primary process and Republican voters were opposed to Donald Trump. But many of those people have come around because they believe that Clinton is worse. So my fundamental thing, when you were talking about rationalizations, actually what I'm doing is I'm trying to give you an analytical picture of what's at stake, okay? And, from my perspective, there are some people who believe that, well, people who support Trump are deplorable, and you should never be involved with people like that. That's one thing I emphatically reject.
Well, you would admit there are some deplorables.
I believe that there are 25% of the country? No. And I think that that is the suggestion that's out there. And I think that it's toxic. And I believe that trying to kind of get us to a place where we say that that number of people are irredeemable, I think is pretty bad. And so from my perspective, as a Republican, I believe that you need to bring the party together. So you're right. At this point, I'm not going to demonize people who disagree with me on this. I don't think it makes a lot of sense. I don't demonize people on the left either for a similar reason.
Obviously, you're biased.
That's my job.
I don't think Hillary Clinton is the worst. You've talked a lot about all the stuff she says. Every time or frequently when Trump says stuff, it's fact-checked. It comes out to be not true. Yet he still has the support. Cruz, I think, is a fine example. The Republicans will back whoever the party puts, regardless of their own personal beliefs. The Democrats don't quite do that. What does Hillary have to do to counteract the Republican Trump thing?
Well, you said a bunch of different things there. One of which is you're talking about fact-checking websites like Politifest. And I will say, as someone who reads pretty widely, I've got to say I don't consider Politifest a reliable source. Now, it's certainly true that Donald Trump says many things that are untrue. That's incontrovertibly true. But I also believe that different levels of scrutiny apply to different candidates. There's a very smart guy, a Democratic political strategist, Howard Wolfson, who worked for Mayor Bloomberg, among many others, voted for Hillary Clinton in the past. And he made a really, really interesting point a few weeks ago. He said that over the years, we have said so much incendiary stuff about every single Republican that by the time you come around to Donald Trump, and actually, Howard Wolfson really believes that Donald Trump is a dangerous figure, really believes that he's a racist, really believes that he is just on a different order of magnitude. The problem is when Joe Biden said that Mitt Romney wants to put y'all back in chains to an audience of African Americans, for some people are thinking, well, look, Donald Trump is terrible, but Jesus H. Christ, they've said the same thing about any number of people before this. The problem is that the rhetoric was so amped up to a certain level that when you're asking, well, why aren't people listening to PolitiFact about this? I think part of the problem is that, when you go to 11 every single election, it's a little bit hard to modulate and hard for people to believe when you're saying, no, you guys, this time it's really different. When we said Mitt Romney was an evil fascist, we were just joking. When we said he wanted to, that he killed a man's wife, who was dying of cancer, we weren't totally serious. But this guy is really dangerous. Now, again, that might even be true. But the thing is, people just don't buy it after a while, right? And I think that that's something that I think a lot of people, journalists, myself included, I belong to a very funny, tiny little group of people. I've been a Republican for a long time, but in 2004, I opposed George W. Bush's reelection. And also now in 2016, I'm not a fan of the Republican presidential nominee. So I believe that, I have a little bit of credibility in saying that, no, this isn't the first time I've said this, and I'm actually kind of like happy to oppose my party's nominee if I believe that it's the right and appropriate thing to do. There are a lot of other people I don't know if, you get the impression that they're going to say the same thing regardless, and then sometimes it's, see what I mean? So I think that that's a big problem. As to what Hillary Clinton can do, I think she's doing what she can do. She employs a lot of really smart people, and what she believes is the right thing to do is this. People are not, for better or for worse, maybe they should be excited about her, but a lot of people aren't that excited about her. So when I characterize the other side, the people supporting Donald Trump, as deplorable, what I'm doing is a very smart thing. What I'm saying is that the forces of darkness are on the other side of this. And by the way, I understand that there's actually some case for that. Maybe you might believe that. I don't want to dismiss this out of hand. So you might not be crazy about me, but I'm the finger in the dike between you and the forces of darkness. For her voters, the voters who kind of still have Bernie stickers on their SUVs, but they don't have I'm with her stickers, and I'll bet a lot of you guys have seen this, or people who still have their Obama stickers on their vehicles, you're in a more of a car culture. That's what a lot of this is about. So you might not like me, but you sure as hell hate them. And I think that that's what she has figured out, and that's what she's going to try to do, and it makes sense from her perspective. Whether or not that's a long-term strategy, I'm skeptical, but who knows?
So you seem like a really smart guy, and I'm just curious, what do you spend your time reading? And is it mostly books, mostly magazine articles, mostly day-to-day news? And also, who are your favorite authors to read?
Well, one great good fortune I have is that I'm surrounded by actually smart people, and I get to absorb a lot of what they think and a lot of what they read. I will say just briefly, that is the great beauty of this job. It is really amazing to get to be in a job where you get to ask questions of smart people all the time. You get to learn from them. And also just even being able to travel. Like, I grew up in a very narrow kind of way. I hadn't even met a Republican until I was like maybe 13 or 14 years old. Actually, well, that's a long story. But for me, and now, I get to meet people whose lives are very, very different from mine. And one thing that's really huge is talking to people who might look at me and see, okay, well, I pretty much figured you out. You're like someone from a big city. You kind of think X, Y, and Z, da-da-da. But then it's like, oh, wait, actually, you surprise people, and then you're surprised by them. So that has been just the most wonderful part of this line of work. As for reading, unfortunately, like a lot of people, and I'll bet Scott has this too, the internet takes over your brain, and so it's really hard to read in a disciplined kind of way, so you just jump from thing to thing. But I do try to make time to read books. So I'd say, but honestly, a lot of my day is spent in front of a computer. That's why I try to stand. I put a laptop on like a little ledge and kind of stand there so I don't become a complete slob. But I just kind of sit there and just kind of like try to read in a disciplined way, and then some thought comes to me, and then I just kind of like look up that thing and what have you. But I also try to read a lot of periodicals that have different perspectives to mine. And that takes some discipline, because sometimes you grit your teeth and you're like, these people are being unfair to people that I like, and people that I like and trust. But it's really important to maintain that discipline, because you never know where you find great ideas from, and trying to have some synthesis. And also, I think my role is oftentimes, there are a lot of people who like me more or less and are friends with me more or less, but who hate each other. So I get to be the middleman. I get to be the person that this guy talks to me. He certainly won't talk to her, but they'll both talk to me. And that's, I almost see that as a responsibility that I have, to try to kind of keep the information flowing between different groups of people.
So I wanted to follow up on this exaggeration of negative language and attacks and demonization and what you just said there about being a bridge. And certainly I think a lot of us in this room, one of the things we love about Voice of San Diego is it's a bridge for our community. But on the national level, we don't see that. We see the left and the right constantly demonizing each other. And I think in a lot of ways, that's created the opening for Trump to say, oh, I'm not one of either of them. I'm something different. And from my perspective, he's something much worse. But how do we fix that? How do we get the Democrats in Congress and the Republicans in Congress to stop demonizing each other and start working together again? I mean, we used to do that.
Well, I believe it's very hard for the reason that it works. In a narrow sense. It works in the sense of like, well, what is your actual job? And one way to think about it is that my actual job is to be reelected, as opposed to, let's say, do X, Y, or Z thing or pass legislation, sort of da-da-da. And, when you look at the nature of our constitutional system, the thing is that our system was designed, and I personally think it's a good thing, but we could disagree about that. A very smart guy named Terry Moe recently co-authored a book called Relic, in which he says that we should have a system in which the president is a lot more powerful. And I happen to disagree with that. But the nature of our system is that it requires a lot of consensus. And Barack Obama's first 2 years were very interesting because basically, because of the Iraq War and because of the financial crisis, you had this very unusual circumstance where you had unified control of both houses of Congress, and you have the presidency, and then you could pass legislation on a partisan basis. And some of that legislation was good, some of it was bad. But the thing is that it was legislation that was really tough because there were a lot of people who resisted it, whereas who were opposed to it. And it didn't reflect that kind of broad consensus, I would argue, and we can disagree about that. And Republicans have, of course, done the same thing, and they were desperate to do it. I mean, their hope was that we're going to get in and we're going to reverse all of that stuff, right? Even though going this way and going that way, our system was not meant to do that. We were supposed to actually, if you're going to entrench something, it has to have a very broad consensus. So one thing is that I actually believe that a lot of our lawmakers and a lot of our politicians, they don't actually understand the nature of our system and what it requires. I'm actually being very straightforward. And I actually believe that our electoral system, and we can talk about that later if you want, actually is a big part of the problem. But we can talk about that further.
So after this, you have three options, and one of them, hosted by Dr. Bailing Shaw, is called Developing Consciousness, and she says that there are SDSU faculty members who have a solution to this negative discourse. So your three choices after this are to, A, there's a debate on stage here about Measure K, which I think is potentially going to be one of the fiercest debates today. That'll be in support of Measure K. Measure K is the one that is requiring a runoff for local elections. In support of that is Mickey Kasparian, the head of the United Food and Commercial Workers Labor Union, and obviously a major labor leader in town. And then with him is Steve Peace, a fiery former state senator. And then on the other side, Councilman Chris Cate, along with Ryan Klumpner, the consultant. And that's going to be a really fierce battle up here. Andrew Keats is moderating it. But you can also go to Eyes on District 9. This is the District 9 City Council race debate, hosted by Taryn Mento at KPBS over in the theater. So a lot of great options for that. But just on your point about discourse, there's an option right after this. This program is fantastic. So very proud of that. Broderick.
Hey, welcome. With the election, we've seen a lot of Trump and the Republicans being the party of Trump now. And you, as a prominent person of color on the right, there are many people who are looking at the Republican Party a lot differently than, let's say, under Bush and under Bush, or looking at Romney and things of that nature. Going forward, how do you see whatever happens with Trump? How do you see the right going forward as being a party that is welcoming to minorities? As right now it's just looking that it's just not the case. I mean, I went to a Cruz rally, here in San Diego, which has a large minority population. I saw very few minorities there, and I'm sure I didn't have a chance to see Trump when he was here. But going forward, and you being on the right, I'd like to hear a little bit about outreach and what you see going forward.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very big issue, and it's something I've given a lot of thought to over the years. I'd say I see it as a subset of a bigger picture issue of where the Republican Party goes, and I see a few different possibilities. There are some people who believe that the party should be less socially conservative and win over more, let's say, of the kind of upper middle income professionals who have been turned off in recent years by the Republican Party. That's one path the party can take.
Like me.
Another path the party could take is, and this is a contested thing, but I believe this is a pattern that I've observed in the world. In 2012 was the first time since 1964 when households earning above $250,000 a year, so pretty wealthy households, voted on a plurality basis more for the Democratic candidate than the Republican candidate. And I believe in 2016 that's also going to be the case. I believe that those households will break for the Democrats this time around. But also the Democrats are supported by a lot of working class non-white folks. Whereas the Republican Party has become much more the party of the white middle class and working class than had been the case before. This is even different than as recently as 2008. That's been the case for decades. It's been moving into that direction, but I think it's become more the case. So one vision for the future of the party is that the Republican Party should be the party not just of the white middle class, but of a pan-ethnic middle class. It's not going to be a party of a majority of black or Latino voters, let's say, but let's say it's a little bit more competitive. With African American voters, let's say you have 10 to 15% of the vote, or a little bit more. Now that's very far from where we are right now, but the way that would happen, and that's a bigger conversation, is partly about saying to people, this party is not hostile to your interests. Because it's amazing, when you look at African Americans, you do have a chunk of that electorate. It varies depending on the survey, but I would say around a quarter to maybe as high as a third that has many conservative views on a lot of issues, including criminal justice issues and what have you. But the irony is that on a kind of political psychology basis, conservatives are much more loyalty-oriented than liberals. Liberals care about fairness, understood as treating people equally and protecting people from harm. Conservatives care less about those things, but they care more about things like loyalty. So the thing is that if you are a member of a minority group in many cases, it could be that for you, loyalty means loyalty to your group. So let's say for me, as someone who's an Asian American, I could believe that, well, okay, but I'm an Asian American, and this group, this party is hostile to my identity on that basis. So even if I agree with them on these issues, that is a voting issue for me. That's a decisive issue for me. Do you see what I mean? So the thing is that, number one, you have to give people permission, quote unquote. And the way you give permission to support a party is by saying that, well, number one, I am not hostile to the group. And if you're looking at Hispanic voters, it's a very interesting dynamic. English-dominant Hispanic voters, native-born Hispanics, they tend to be much friendlier to Republican candidates than foreign-born Hispanics, and also Hispanics who are bilingual or also who are predominantly Spanish-speaking. There are lots of subtleties to these things, but I would argue that when we talk about group identity in this country right now, we always talk about it as a pentagon: black, Hispanic, Asian, white, American Indian. We don't actually talk about the subtleties and the differences within those groups, including religious faith and kind of any number of other things. So if the Republican Party is going to have success in the future with non-white voters, which it must, then it needs to think about people in these more granular ways, needs to think about people as individuals, but number one, it has to give people permission by moving away from this, kind of appearance of intense hostility.
We have time for one more, right?
There's been a lot of attention paid to what I guess some people call a double standard with regards to how people perceive or fact check Trump versus Hillary. And especially with, I mean, you could go back to, emails. Hillary's emails are all out there, or at least some of them are. Her tax records, her medical records are all viewable by the public. And for Trump, he's had the luxury of not being in the public light, and so his aren't. And there seems to be a lot of expectation that the perception that she is not as transparent as he is, and she hides stuff and all that. And I was wondering if you could speak to whether or not you actually think there is a double standard, and if so, why that might be. Because, I mean, even the double standard also could extend to expectations for how they comport themselves. And Trump's expectation is basically that for him to exceed expectations, all he has to do is not say something crazy, and then he's done a good job. And as a debates approach, it seems like as long as he hangs with her and talks coherently.
I think I get the idea. So basically, and your view, I'm sure, is widely shared in the audience, and I think is a totally sane one and respectable one. Matt Taibbi of Rolling Stone is a journalist. He's a journalist who's been written a lot about attacking the banks and what have you. And he wrote an interesting piece about this issue recently, which I thought made a lot of sense, and I would recommend it to you. So basically, this is not what you're saying, but one version of that is that, look, all of this scrutinizing of Hillary Clinton is ridiculous. If you're the New York Times, if you're NBC News, if you're kind of you've got to go all in on just talking about how outrageous Trump is. That has to be your focus. Now, if you believe that the media hasn't done that, then it may well be that you and I are reading different things. I believe that actually every single outrageous inflammatory remark has been reported on, but I also believe that there's some reporters who believe that, well, I also have an obligation to report on Hillary Clinton, and kind of these are things that in any other election, if these were things that a Republican candidate had done, I think that these things would be covered. So I guess there's some journalists, including, by the way, people who are themselves left of center, they're registered Democrats and what have you, but they believe that, look, I have an obligation. Yes, it's true that Donald Trump says crazy things, and I have other people here at the New York Times, the Washington Post, or the San Diego Union Tribune, or the Voice of San Diego who are doing that job, but I can't just not do my job about another candidate because the other candidate might be terrible. And kind of my own feeling is that actually I see the media echoing a lot of messages that Hillary Clinton wants to advance, but I also see kind of other elements in the media being critical of her, and I think that ultimately it's. The media is a bunch of different institutions, right? It's a bunch of different places. And I think you will absolutely find media outlets that are not going to focus on Hillary Clinton's, various issues. But, the media is fragmented. And another thing that happens is the media operates in a marketplace. So the thing is that, think about in Germany recently. There were, during New Year's celebrations, there was concern about a group of men who were hassling women in ways that people found very disturbing. There was basically a blanket ban on reporting this news for a while, and then on social media, people started reporting it. Okay? So one of the dynamics for these media institutions is if we don't report on the emails or what have you, it's not like other people don't have Twitter accounts. It's not like other people can't start WordPress blogs that are reporting on the things that you think it's, excuse me, not you, but one might think is inappropriate for the New York Times or NBC News or these other mainstream institutions to do, right? So the thing is that people now realize that these media institutions don't have the authority they used to. There are any number of independent bloggers who could make their message heard if those institutions don't do that. So I think that there's this attitude a lot of people have, well, the media just decides what gets covered. It doesn't work that way anymore. It's things that are bottom up, that bubble up, and those things are going to get reported one way or another.
Except for us, we control everything in San Diego. Reihan, Salam, everyone, thank you.